We're now on record. So can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So let me share my screen. Let's go to our group 9 City Campus. So this is our core syllabus. And we should go straight to the schedule of work. The work that we just finished in our last class. So we're going to summarize this work now before we call for questions. So the first class we had, we discussed different types of sentence-shaped thought. We recognized the different kinds of speech acts. We saw interrogatives, which are sentences spoken to solicit information from someone. We saw imperatives, which are sentences spoken to get someone to do something. We saw declaratives, which are sentences spoken to provide information, and there are 4 types. We have factual statements, value judgments, definitions, and arguments. Then for factual statements, we said they are statements about the external world. Definitions are sentences spoken to convey information about the meaning of something. Value judgments are sentences showing what people think about something's value, And then we have 2 types of value judgments. We have the moral and non-moral. Then we have emotive expressions. We have sentence fragments. And that was what we did for that first class. For the second class, we did definitions. So definitions, we first of all saw the 2 parts of a sentence in definitions. We saw the definiendum and definiens. We said the definiendum is that part of the sentence to be defined. The definiens is that part of the sentence that does the defining. It's just like a subject and predicate. Then from there, we saw types of definitions. We saw lexical definitions. We saw ostensive definitions. We saw the theoretical definitions. The lexical definitions are the dictionary ones. Ostensive definitions, the definitions you can't put in words, definitions that you can only show by physical demonstration. We saw the theoretical definitions, definitions that originate from specific academic disciplines. We saw stipulative definition, those kinds of definitions that you can formulate at any time for a particular purpose. We saw operational definitions, definitions that outline a kind of procedure or operation. Then we saw the essential definitions. We said these are definitions that we regard as real definitions. We said essential definitions are the only definitions that are completely accurate. Every other definition is essentially contestable. And then we saw problems with definitions. We said definitions are too broad if the definiens refers to items that go beyond what is needed to define a definiendum. And we said definitions are too narrow if the definiens refers to items that are not enough to define the definiendum. Then definitions are vague if there's no way of telling what class of things the definiens refers to. Definitions are ambiguous if they present more than one possible meaning. And then definitions are secular if the definiens repeats the definiendum, such as morality is to be morally right. And we said definitions beg the question if the definiens is obscure or digresses from progressing meaning, providing meaning, or does not help in shedding meaning on the definiendum. And so that was what we did about definitions. After the second class on definitions, we did the third class on discourses, types of discourses, and I think they are here. So let's get the slides on types of discourses. We said discourses are also called passages. We said there are two kinds of discourses or passages. We have argumentative and non-argumentative discourses. We said an argument is a passage containing a conclusion and at least one claim. We saw example of argument. We saw how to identify arguments. Then we saw the non-arguments, the narratives, instructional passages, the rhetorical polemic. With narratives are reports of sequence of events. Instructional passage is a collection of imperatives. Rhetorical polemic is a passage communicating strong feeling. You know, we said rhetorical polemic could contain claims, just like arguments. But you know, whereas claims in arguments are surrounded by premises that support them, claims in rhetorical polemic are just surrounded by emotive expressions. Then we saw verbal and real disputes. We said verbal disputes arise from confusion about the meaning of something, but real disputes are disputes about facts and values. So that was it about types of discourses. After discussing discourses, we discussed the normative and the empirical, metaphors and proverbs, and then senses of law. So let's look at the slide, the normative and the empirical. So when we started the normative and the empirical, we discussed facts and values. We revisited the issues of the facts and values, and we said values are about what we should or should not do. Facts are about what is or is not. But we said sometimes we mistake value statements for factual statements. You know, for instance, the factual statement, the president has lifted a lockdown. If you put rightly in it, if you say the president has rightly lifted a lockdown, then it becomes a value judgment. Then we saw metaphors and proverbs. We said metaphors are statements that shouldn't be interpreted literally. And then, but for proverbs, you can interpret them literally because their literal interpretation is reasonable. Their non-literal interpretation is also reasonable, you know. So that's the difference between proverbs and metaphors. Metaphors, we don't interpret them literally because their literal interpretation is not normally, it's not often reasonable. Okay, so in addition to being able to interpret proverbs literally, their non-literal interpretation also serves to provide a piece of advice. You know. And then we saw meaning defects in language. We saw vagueness. You know, an expression is vague if its meaning has no boundaries of application. The sentence is ambiguous when it's capable of more than one meaning. We saw lexical ambiguity, referential ambiguity. We saw sentential ambiguity. Then we saw equivocation. Equivocation is when someone takes advantage of the ambiguity in a word to play with that word to generate different meanings in the same passage. Then that's equivocation. You know, we saw the examples, we saw how to identify equivocation, and then we went to the senses of law. We saw natural laws, civil law, we saw cultural norms, we saw customary law, we saw moral law, logical law, mathematical and divine laws. So that was about that class. And that was the end of the first half of the semester. So that was to prepare us for the second half, which is to study arguments. So after this class, we went into arguments and we began with deductive argument or deductive reasoning. We said deductive reasoning is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. And because of this, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. We saw an example of a deductive argument. We saw the difference between reference and attribute classes. This is just like the difference between definiendum and definiens. You know, so the reference class is like the subject, the attribute class is like the predicate. And we have two kinds of reference classes, the finite and infinite. Because of that, we have universal and particular statements. And so then we discuss the issue of validity. What makes an argument valid? An argument is valid if it is either a modus ponens or a modus tollens. If it is an argument that denies the antecedent, then it is not valid. If it affirms the consequent, it is not valid. So only when an argument affirms the antecedent or denies the consequent that it is valid. So we have two valid arguments. We have modus ponens and modus tollens. Then the third and fourth one are hypothetical syllogism and disjunctive syllogism. So those are the four valid kinds of deductive reasoning. And every other one is invalid. We saw how to arrive at modus ponens and modus tollens. We also saw how to arrive at their fallacies. Now, we compared deductive argument to inductive argument. This is an example of inductive argument, and we saw how different it is from deductive argument. We saw that inductive argument can generate more than one possible conclusion. And then we returned to deductive argument. We saw the hidden conditional if and then, And so now I can also say that when you are working with a deductive argument, you have to try to convert all the premises to conditionals. You will find out that it is only one premise that you can convert to a conditional. Every other premise cannot be converted. So it is only that premise that you can convert to a conditional that will give you the antecedent and the consequent. And then every other sentence will be referring to any other sentence that follows it will be referring to either the antecedent or the consequent. It is either that sentence is denying or affirming the antecedent, or it is affirming or denying the consequent. So that's basically how to work on a deductive argument. So you can see this example here. Premise one has been converted into a conditional. That is where you find the antecedent and the consequent. So with that you can arrive at, and so when you have identified your antecedent and the consequent, then you are able to see four ways of making the argument. It is either the argument affirms the antecedent, or it denies the antecedent, or it affirms the consequent, or it denies the consequent. Either of the four ways. Now, two of them are valid, two of them are not valid. We saw how to arrive at the valid ones and how to arrive at the ones that are not valid. But the rule for deductive reasoning is that we only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. Any other operation would make the argument lose its validity. So those arguments that deny the antecedent and affirm the consequent are formal fallacies. The fallacy of denying the antecedent and the fallacy of affirming the consequent. We used all kinds of examples, symbols, drawings, diagrams, boxes to show how it works. And then we went to hypothetical syllogism. So we saw how hypothetical syllogism works. All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. We said the consequent of a particular premise would be the antecedent of any other premise that follows it. So what the conclusion does is to pair the very first antecedent and the very last consequent. So we saw the two hypothetical fallacies and how they work. Then we saw disjunctive syllogism. Now we didn't read if any fallacy of disjunctive syllogism. That's because disjunctive syllogism has a fallacy that is too obvious to be taught. So there's no way somebody is going to commit a fallacy of disjunctive syllogism, because the fallacy will be too simple. Even children will not commit it. If you say either A is true or B is true, A is true, so A is true, no one will say that. Or you say A is true or B is false, so B is true, so A is true. That cannot. So the fallacy is too simple for anyone to commit. That's why we don't teach it. Either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I became a reverend father. No. Or either I became a reverend father and I got married. I became a reverend father, so I got married. No one is going to commit that, you know. Then we saw validity versus soundness. We asked whether a valid argument is a sound argument, and we said no, not all the time. An argument could be valid, but it is not sound. For an argument to be valid, it follows all the correct rule of deductive reasoning. But if the information in the argument is not correct, then the argument is not true and it is not sound. So we can have valid but unsound argument. For an argument to sound, it should be both valid and true. So that was the end of our treatment of deductive reasoning. And then we went to inductive reasoning. So let's get the slide on inductive reasoning. We said inductive reasoning is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not a logical relationship. It's possible to affirm all the premises and deny the conclusion without contradiction. So because of that, the premises are capable of producing more than one possible conclusion. And so inductive arguments, the premises provide reason for believing in the likelihood of the conclusion, but the premises don't guarantee the conclusion. So because of that, inductive arguments are probability arguments, and because inductive arguments don't depend on rules, they are much more difficult to evaluate, And so we distinguished between verifiable and confirmable statements, and we arranged them to see that verifiable statements are normally the premises of inductive arguments. Confirmable statements are normally the conclusions. Now, another word for the conclusion of inductive arguments, apart from confirmable statement, is what? Is hypothesis. And you have two basic kinds of hypothesis. You have the law-like hypothesis and you have the statistical hypothesis. Now, the law-like hypothesis are those hypotheses that refer to all members of a class. So they use the infinite reference class. But the statistical hypotheses are those hypotheses that refer to particular members of a class. That's the finite reference class. So those are the two kinds of inductive arguments. The ones ending with law-like hypothesis as conclusions, and the ones ending with statistical hypothesis as conclusions. And then we thought deductive arguments are kind of extrapolations. That is, extrapolations mean something like guessing, something that you are not sure of. You are just, it's like an advanced form of guesswork. So we said there are different directions of extrapolations. We have part whole extrapolations, saying that something applies to a whole because it applies to parts, or it applies to parts because it applies to almost all of a whole. We have statistical syllogisms, we have generalization, we have analogies, we have predictions. Analogy is to say that something applies to another thing because both of them are similar in other ways. Prediction is to say that something applies to the future because it happened in the past. So they are all inductive arguments. So we saw the two kinds of inductive arguments, the one based on law-like hypothesis. And then we saw the ones based on statistical hypothesis. And we said the ones based on statistical hypothesis are a little bit safer to make. Now, after that, we compared inductive to deductive arguments. We said deductive arguments are accurate at the expense of the inability to provide information. On the other hand, inductive arguments provide information at the expense of accuracy. And I think that was what we saw in that class. We said any empirical statement must be falsifiable. If a statement is completely correct, then it doesn't contain an empirical information. So from there, we went to causal reasoning. So causal reasoning, we said causal reasoning is a type of inductive argument. We can't call it deductive argument because it is not a guarantee. Causal reasoning is not always completely correct. So it doesn't have a complete and foul-proof accuracy. Because of that, we have to rank it in the inductive category of arguments. And it is a type of inductive argument that is reasoning from cause to effect and sometimes from effect to cause. We have different senses of the word cause. We saw proximate cause, contributory cause, necessary, sufficient cause. We saw probabilistic cause, causal agent. We saw causal chain and web. We explained them. And then we went to look at the we selected 3 kinds of informal causal reasoning patterns. The kinds of the 3 informal ways that we as human beings are able to identify causes. We saw them, we selected them out of 5 approaches that John Stuart Mill had proposed in his book. The first one is relevant difference reasoning. We said when there's a problem in an environment, we start asking ourselves, what is different in this environment, as a way of trying to find out the origin of this problem. What has started happening differently in my environment, so that I'll know if it is the cause of a problem that has started happening in my environment. Then we have common thread, which is to find out if there is something that is common among all cases of a particular problem. That will be common thread. And then concomitant variation. And so if you can find something that is common to all cases, then that explains the problem that all those cases have. Then we have concomitant variation, which is to measure something that is in the environment that will never be eliminated. There are certain things that are always in the environment, but sometimes they can be causing problems. So if they are causing problems, it's not because they are present in the environment, but it's because they are present at a degree that is not healthy. For instance, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, selenium in the soil, and so on. After that, we started looking at causal fallacies. Causal fallacies are instances of bad causal reasoning, or ways in which we shouldn't identify causes. We started with post hoc ego propter hoc, the fallacy of inferring causality from chronology. Now, just because A happened before B doesn't mean that A must have caused B, So if you want to know whether A caused B, you have to do proper investigation, not just that A happened before B. Then we have non-causal pro-causal. If A caused B and you say that B caused A, then you are committing non-causal pro-causal, the fallacy of exchanging cause with effect. Then we have oversimplified cause. That is, if there are more than one causes of something, or there are many causes, and you say it is only one cause, or you didn't identify the number of causes that are adequate for the effect. Then we have false common thread, identifying a common thread that is not true. If you say, for instance, that all the bright people in your class are driving cars, so you need to get a car in order to be academically bright. That will be a false common thread. Then we have confusing correlation with causation. The fact that 2 things always happen together don't always mean that one of them is causing the other. So that's confusing correlation with causation. And then we have slippery slope, to argue that if something happens, then it will lead to a more serious thing, and that one will lead to another thing that is more serious and more serious, more serious, and the order of seriousness will continue to increase without any justification. That will be a slippery slope argument. And I think that was the last thing we did for that class. After that, we went to informal fallacies. So by the time we started doing informal fallacies, we had already seen many other fallacies. We saw fallacies of meaning, we saw formal fallacies, we saw fallacies of denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, hypothetical fallacies, and then we also saw causal fallacies. Now, so we wanted to do some other kinds of fallacies, but first of all, we wanted to make comments about some of the fallacies we already did. We said equivocation, shifting between 2 meanings of a single word in an argument without indicating the shift. We saw example of equivocation in argument, how it works in an argument, because the previous ones we saw were not in an argument. They were just casual statements. Then we saw secularity in argument. You know, this one is different from secularity in definition. Secularity in definition is to repeat the definitions, to repeat the definiendum in definiens. But secularity in argument is to repeat the conclusion as a premise. We saw how it works, and then we went to grandstanding, which is appeal to majority. We said appealing to majority is wrong because majority is not always right. We saw ad hominem, which is probably the most common fallacy that people commit, praising or attacking people instead of addressing their arguments. Then we saw appeal to authority, appealing to someone's authority instead of defending an argument with with facts. Then we saw genetic fallacy. Genetic fallacy is to say that something is right or wrong depending on where it comes from. You know. Then we saw appeal to threat, arguing that people should support a conclusion because if they don't support it, something could happen to them. Then appeal to pity, defending a conclusion by whipping up sympathy. Then we saw the fallacies of manipulating the data. We saw three of them. First of all, we saw the fallacy of misplaced vividness. If you say, for instance, that Africans are no longer marginalized because Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of United Nations. So that means Africans are no longer marginalized. So that's a fallacy of misplaced vividness, you know, because we are using the case of the case of Kofi Annan, which is so vivid to deny a general problem of the marginalization of Africans. Then we have the fallacy of semi-attached figures, using figures that don't properly fit a conclusion to defend the conclusion. And then we have hasty generalization, which is to judge an entire population based on a few samples in the population. We saw several examples, and I think that was the end of that class, as well as the semester. So now I could take a few questions. Any of you who has a question to ask, please, you have to raise your hand, and then I'll permit you to go ahead. I will address your question. After that, I'll close this class, and then I'll upload the video to Sakai so that those of you who couldn't attend the class can start watching it, the recording. Okay, so if you have a question, ask it, and whoever is sharing his screen should close that screen immediately. Okay, so Akoso Asara. So Akoso Asara Edu Jamfi, I thought you had a question, or unless you raised your hand by accident. Okay, so please prepare for your IA by next week, which begins from Monday. And after the IA, I would consider giving a second chance to all those who who experience technical difficulties in doing their IA. In doing any of the assignments. So I'll give you guys a second chance to do those assignments, you know. Now, since this is the last class, I encourage all of you to work hard so that you'll be great people in future. Remember to obey all the moral principles so that you'll be responsible citizens and you can contribute to the country and the continent. Okay, so goodbye and God bless you.
Thank you, sir.